Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Today, we launched the OECD Starting Strong Teaching and Learning International Survey, also known as TALIS Starting Strong, the first international survey that focuses on the workforce in early childhood education and care. TALIS Starting Strong asks staff in early childhood education and care about their working conditions and their perspectives on educating the early years, looking at everything from the type of things young children learn in these settings to the staff views on policy priorities. 9 countries were included in the survey: Chile, Denmark, Germany, Iceland, Israel, Japan, Korea, Norway, and Turkey. Andreas Schleicher, Director of Education and Skills at the OECD, is joining us today to talk about the results of TALIS Starting Strong and what they mean for early education. I am also joined by OECD Senior Analyst Stephanie Germain. Please feel free to send us your questions via the question moderator on the chat function here, or via email to edu.contact@oecd.org. Also, the PowerPoint that Andreas is presenting will be made available online after this presentation. Andreas, over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much and welcome. This is a very exciting day. It's the very first time that we have data on the work and life of teachers in pre-primary education. And it's actually surprising how much variability you can see in what those teachers do and who they are. When we talk about primary schools, we have a pretty good idea who the teachers are. We select them carefully, we educate them in similar ways. We have typically a quite explicit curriculum, so we know what students learn in primary school. Primary school is a public enterprise, generally publicly provided, publicly financed. When you look at the early years, you can't really take any of that for granted. It's a very you can see a lot of variability both within and between countries. So actually having a comparative picture of primary teachers and teaching is so important. Again, it's the very first time that this is available. It's still a small group of countries, but I'm certain, for TALIS and PISA, that group of countries is going to grow rapidly as the survey progresses. And I'm joined by Stephanie Germain, actually, who's the mastermind of the project, who's designed the survey and administered and analyzed those kinds of results. So she will be responding to your questions together with me. Let me start giving you a first look through the results. First of all, it's an international survey of staff. It didn't only look at teachers and staff, it also looked at the leaders, look at who they are, their working environment, their training, their satisfaction with their work, and so on. The countries you have already heard about. It's a group of 9 countries that have assessed the project. Sometimes you may be looking for data from Denmark. Unfortunately, the technical quality in terms of response rates from teachers was not sufficient to have Denmark fully compared, but you can see the rest of the countries. We looked at 2 levels of education. Pre-primary education is our basis for the comparisons across all countries, and then some countries had also looked at the settings for children who at very young ages, not children under the age of 3. So let's start with the most interesting question. What do staff actually do with the children? And we looked at essentially different kind of aspects. We looked at, first of all, the practices, relating to intellectual cognitive development, language, literacy, numeracy. But we also looked at practices facilitating social and emotional development. It's actually what's quite interesting for us that the latter actually often dominate the work of pre-primary teachers. We also looked at practices that actually are being used to facilitate group organization, also how do teachers engage with targeted differentiation, how they provide individual support, and how they relate to parents. Let me start with the first topic. How do teachers, what are the kind of top practices to support language literacy, numeracy as well? And you can see the number 1, basically across systems, is singing songs or rhymes. So elementary language development, except in Japan, where you can see actually they ask the teachers to position themselves at the children's height, sort of to place themselves in the shoes of children or children, where actually the emphasis is very much on sort of helping children use numbers, counting, sort of the more formal aspects of numeracy, using books, picture books, very common practice in most systems, and also encouraging children to talk to each other. Now, those were sort of the most dominant practices when it comes to the cognitive development of children. When it comes to social and emotional development, the first thing is about encouraging children to help each other, sort of building that kind of personal social competency, relationships. Hug the children, Korea, Israel, sort of a very important aspect of social emotional development. Show enjoyment when joining play. Look at the example of Japan there. So I think that this kind of social aspect, the collaborative aspect, really comes out very, very strong. Encouraging children, if they comfort each other, very quite common, talking with children about their feelings, encouraging sharing amongst children. Those were all common activities, but you can see they play out slightly differently across the systems for which we have comparative data. What's also interesting, and I mentioned that already at the beginning, when you look at the relative importance, you can see practices to support social emotional development seem to be more prevalent than practices that focus solely on literacy and numeracy. That's pretty common across countries, and that's actually also something that neuroscience has supported lately, that actually the particular windows that early childhood education and care offers for the social and emotional development of children, which often has very important long-term effects. When you look at emotional control of social skills, often these are developed in the very first years of life, and later on they become things like personality traits, character qualities. Things are much harder to change, so the early years provide a very unique window, and you can see actually in most systems that is quite well understood and incorporated in practices. Now, whereas often the cognitive development then comes at a later point. Basically, what you see here is simply the percentage of staff who say that the various practices apply a lot. So that's basically the kind of dominant kind of practices. When you ask yourself on the social emotional skills, how do teachers actually see that relating to the future lives of children? Or where do they see sort of these are very, very important predictors or requisites for being successful? The children's ability to cooperate easily with others. That's the top priority for leaders, but also for staff. Leaders in gray, staff in dark blue. Children's oral language skills. Children's ability to inquire based on their own curiosity. Children's ability to think imaginatively, creatively, then physical and motor skills, and then actually the kind of reasoning logically, think critically, math, writing, science, technology, they come at a relatively lower rank. So when you ask teachers about what they consider to be of high importance. So it gives you sort of a sense of the kind of pedagogical beliefs of teachers in pre-primary education. And I would actually think this is quite well in sync with what research tells us about social and emotional development of children. So engaging with the children is one thing, but what are the kind of practices that staff use to facilitate the engagement of parents? And you can see two things here. One is, parents can get in touch with teachers easily. Now that's the blue bar. You can see that's a lot more common, and parents or guardians are encouraged by staff to play and do learning and play with their children at home. But there are important or different patterns on this. You can see, for example, in the case of Israel or Korea, the gap, or Chile, or Turkey, the gap is much narrower than in, for example, Norway, Iceland, or Germany. In Norway, you can see virtually all teachers saying, well, I try to facilitate the interaction between parents and staff, but it's a lot less common to ask or to encourage parents to do sort of more play and learning with their children at home. So you can see those things vary across countries. They obviously also vary significantly across centers. These are not just, system-wide. The average here hides a lot of variability within countries, but you can see sort of differences in patterns of this. What do teachers do to facilitate transition from early childhood education and care to primary education? One thing that we found very interesting is that there is actually in many countries a quite high percentage of leaders who actually hold meetings with primary level people. That's something that is, if pre-primary teachers have a good understanding of how primary school staff see the children and how they're sort of going to connect with this, they can sort of prepare for that link. Because we know from research, from our starting strong studies, that often that bridge between early childhood education and care and primary schooling leads to a lot of frictions and fractures. A lot of information that is gained in early childhood education and care is lost when children go to primary school. And that is a particular issue for children from disadvantaged backgrounds where parents may not be as active in facilitating this transition. So having meetings with primary school staff can be one way to facilitate the transition. And actually, you can see in countries like Iceland, Turkey, Norway, Germany, that is already very common, whereas systems like Korea, Israel, Chile have probably a longer way to go on this. We also looked at how do teachers or staff engage with specific groups of children. We call it a target group, normally in a kind of play group, kindergarten, staff work with a specific setting, with a specific group. And we then asked them to what extent do they think always or most of the time. And you can see, for example, when it comes to behavioral issues, asking children to quieten down, that's basically happening almost or always or most of the times for almost half of the staff. And then calming children who are upset, obviously that's a big responsibility. But when you also look to adapt to children's interests and needs, you can see adapting activities to differences and cultures to the children's cultural background is less common, 90% of the children, and then presenting activities that extend children's abilities, also that is at half of the level. So you can see basically things that are common with specific groups of children across the spectrum. One of the kind of more structural characteristics is what is the size of a target group, sort of the kind of group that staff would interact with typically. And you can see enormous variation. In pre-primary education, you can see, for example, in Norway or Turkey or Korea or Iceland, to some extent Germany, you can see actually those groups tend to be well below 20, more in the area of 16, 17, 18. Whereas if you look to Israel, you have almost 30 children in a group, which is quite large. What's actually quite interesting, even for children under the age of 3, in Israel, you get beyond the number of 25. So actually staff have to deal with quite large groups of children. So you can see actually that varies across systems quite a bit, how we utilize resources, the staff-child ratio. Now, that was sort of gave you a taste of what staff do. And you find a lot of more interesting data on this in our report. The next question I want to briefly look at is who are the staff who work with the children? What do we know about them through the survey? And why is this important? Because we actually know that there's often important relationships between those characteristics of staff and what they actually do. Staff who have higher levels of educational attainment, higher qualifications, are more likely to basically also, use educational activities more systematically. Their diagnostic capacity may be better. They may better understand how different students or different children learn and play. Years of experience obviously matters. To what extent this is something that you do just for a few years as a transition or actually as a major kind of occupation. To what extent are staff trained to work with specifically with children? No? That's something which you might think is very common. Actually, you're going to see in a moment. There's not as common as you might think. And then what specific role would they have in a target group? Now, all of those things can actually shape the what question that we just studied. So let's have a look at this. Here you can see the percentage of staff with post-secondary, non-tertiary education, now short cycle tertiary education. That's basically something sort of below a bachelor's degree, something you do beyond, high school, but not really sort of at the level of what we could call a bachelor's degree or higher qualification. And I've marked and you can see the gray part of the bar is, that kind of post-secondary below degree level education. You can see in Japan, that would be, you talk about 80%, and then you have about 20% of the staff who have a bachelor's degree or higher. You can see in Turkey is almost the other way around. Most staff would have had a bachelor degree, only few have only a shorter qualification. Also, Germany would be in that kind of categories. You can see actually countries vary in the level of education. I've also marked with a kind of green triangle here to what extent staff are specifically trained to work with children. And again, you might think that's the norm, and you can see in countries like Japan and Germany, it is the norm. But you can see other countries, look at Iceland, where this is only happening for, 60% of the cases, or, Turkey and Chile, where you're talking still below 80%. So actually, a lot of staff working with children are well educated, but not necessarily have specific education to work with children. One thing is, how well staff are educated when they enter the profession. A similarly important question is, what do they do afterwards to grow in their careers? Now, to what extent do they participate in professional development? And here you can see just those percentages. And what I've done is I've separated here staff who have already a high level of education, a bachelor's degree or more, and those who just have a post-secondary, below tertiary qualification. And what you can see here very clearly is that those staff who have a higher degree, bachelor's or more, are more likely to engage in professional development. But generally, and I think that's a very encouraging kind of finding, is that professional development, continued professional development is actually quite common. We can see actually that it's the rule rather than the exception that staff continue to develop their professional capacities, and it's obviously something that is enormously important. Now, you can be a highly qualified staff member, but the world around you is changing very quickly. The children are changing very quickly. The technologies are changing very quickly. So continued professional development is really important. Now, doing it is one thing. What do you actually do? And when we actually ask the teachers, where do you feel the greatest need for professional development? By a large margin, the number one is dealing, sort of helping children with special needs, engaging with the diversity of children. You're going to see this in a moment. In some countries, the children are becoming quite diverse in their kind of cultural background, social background, cognitive background, and actually dealing with that diversity and engaging children with special needs is something where most teachers feel I really need more professional development. Dual language learners is quite related to this. Again, children who have sort of that kind of dual language capacity. It's a great, wealth that children bring with us who grow up with multiple languages. But what can early childhood education and care do to facilitate this? Facilitating creativity. Look, in Korea, that's the number one aspect these days. In fact, a couple of days ago, I had a lot of meetings in Korea. This idea that, in the times in which we live, the imaginative capacity of children is something really important. And early childhood education and care is our best opportunity for this. Working with parents. It's easy to say, well, engage with parents, but how to do this? How do you actually work, particularly with parents, perhaps from, less less well-educated parents, who for whom, they may be thinking more about care than about education. So working with parents is important, and things like this. You can basically see the needs for professional development may be diverse across countries, but there's clearly some common patterns of where probably we need to do better to provide, good level of continued professional development. Concentration in centers of children with special needs. That's actually one of the things I already referred to. Here you can see in blue where there are centers with 11% of more children with special needs. You can see in places like Chile or Iceland, this is quite high. And then in the gray bar, you can see the share of teachers, share of centers where there are more than 11% of children with a different first language. And look, at Iceland or Germany or Norway, where we're talking about a very high percentage of children, where sort of the language role of early childhood education and care becomes really important. Again, that translates into the qualification of teachers. Understanding the different language needs is something that seems to be now a very, very important priority for teachers. Now, it's one thing to say what you need, and the other thing is whether you actually do this. So we ask staff also to talk about some of the barriers to participation in professional development. Here you can see the percentage of pre-primary staff who strongly agree, or at least agree, about the following barriers. And then, the first barrier is there are no people who can make up for my gap, not enough staff to compensate my absence. Some say it's too expensive. There are financial barriers. I have no time. I'm busy. It conflicts with my work schedule. The one thing that I found troubling is that many teachers also perceive that there are no incentives for participating. That is not, translating into different ways of working, maybe better support also. No time, again, no relevant professional development offered. Now look at this. You have, over a third of teachers who say, actually, I need professional development, but I can't find something that relates to what I really need in the practice. Lack of employer support. Again, over a third of staff saying that, my boss doesn't really support that kind of work. Things like this. So there are important barriers. Again, I should say these are the perceived barriers. It's very hard to assess from these responses to what extent, those are just things that people, perceive to be obstructing them from professional development, or whether those are objective conditions. Let me talk a little bit about the relationship between staff working conditions and their practices. Conditions in which we work, the organization of work, always have an influence of how we work and the kind of practices that we use. And one of the most striking finding from our survey is that most staff in most countries feel highly valued by the children they serve. You're getting close to 100% in all countries except Japan. They also feel highly valued by the families they serve. Here we have data pretty much in close to 100% except for Japan. But when you ask them the question, does society look positively at you? Do you feel valued by society as a whole? The numbers drop a lot below those levels. Highest is Israel, but you look to Japan or Iceland, where you talk about, around a third of teachers. Germany as well, Chile. This is something really striking, that there is a general perception among staff, the people I work with directly, they appreciate what I'm doing. But society doesn't appreciate. Society doesn't invest in early childhood education the same way as it invests in primary school. Pay levels are sometimes well below the pay levels of primary teachers, which has no reason other than history. We think somehow is more difficult or requires higher levels of education to educate primary school students, whereas actually research shows it's actually often much harder to work with children at younger ages who cannot express themselves so well. So that is something I think most countries need to work on. How can the status of the profession be elevated so that it's appreciated, so perceived appreciation is higher? Again, I must say these are the perceptions of staff. The perceptions about what society thinks about them is not necessarily, we don't have a first-hand view of what society really says about the staff. But again, the perception is very influential on the behavior of people. Would you want your own child to become, an early childhood education teacher, or rather than a lawyer? Things like this, making this work financially sufficiently attractive. I think we should think about those things. We also looked at the contractual status and the working hours, and you can see that working full-time is quite common in most countries, but not all. But working full-time doesn't mean working with a permanent contract. Look at Korea, for example, where you can see actually most people devote all of their time to that, but actually only a small minority of people work with a permanent contract. The opposite is in Germany. Now, basically, people generally have a permanent contract, but actually many do that not as a full-time job. Variability in the contractual status and in the extent to which this is a full-time or part-time occupation. We also ask, about the perceived sources of stress. We asked the pre-primary staff to tell us which of the factors are a lot or quite a lot source of stress. And then the first thing that comes up from more than half of the staff is a lack of resources, financial, material, staff resources. Now that's where we hear that hinders us a lot, or is quite a bit of source of stress. Too many children in my classroom, playgroup. Also, half of the staff saying either a lot or quite a bit of source of stress. Too much work related to documenting children's development, paperwork. Too much administrative work to do, managing classroom group behavior, extra duties due to absent staff, and things like this. You can see actually there's a whole range of things that people perceive are getting in the way of their work and become a factor driving stress. We also ask them not only, what makes you stressed, but actually what are the reasons to leave the staff role. Here you can see the staff reports across countries of the single most likely reason why they might leave their job. Obviously, retirement is one way to leave the job, but also health-related issues, working in a different job, basically moving to another field, family responsibilities, and things like this. You can see actually there are different reasons why people want to leave the job, and actually quite a sizable share saying that, that might not be my first choice. Very briefly on funding and governance, we looked at, we asked the staff to tell us, if we would give you more money, how would you spend it? Of course, we know how governments actually do spend the money, but we rarely ask the people at the front line, what do you think about it? How would you spend additional money? And here you can see the answer. Now, the top priority often is to reducing group size by recruiting more staff. You can look at, Germany, Israel, Norway, Denmark, telling us that is sort of a big thing. But it's interestingly also that this actually doesn't relate when you square that with the group sizes that I just showed you earlier. It's actually quite interesting that this priority of reducing group size is not necessarily related to the actual group size. Improving salaries, again, often a priority. That's in some countries quite obvious. Actually, salaries in the countries which express that this is a priority often are relatively low. Supporting children with special needs, additional resources to give it to those who need the most, high quality professional development, and so on. Material resources came a little bit less. It seems that centers are quite well equipped on that. Who are the leaders of early childhood education centers? Now, basically, here we looked again at the levels of qualifications or training that staff had. Do they come out of early childhood education and care? Do they have some training in administration? And interestingly, also, their pedagogical leadership. In a center, you need to develop staff, human resources, and so on. You can see again how this varies across countries. And most countries for which we have data, actually sort of the experience with children is very important for center leaders. And others, you look at Chile and Turkey, that is less common. And then the administrative experience is quite important in a number of countries. Look at Korea, basically everybody gets a high percentage of formal education in those fields, whereas you look to Germany or Israel, a lot less common. We also ask the leaders, what are the major drivers of stress? And here the paperwork comes out on top, not too much administrative work, keeping up with changing requirements from authorities, and that's the regulatory frameworks. And you can look at this in two minds. On the one hand, you can say, well, early childhood education is a lot more patchy than primary schooling. Yet, trying to make that more coherent, quality assurance, all of those things is then perceived to be as a kind of additional workload by principals. Lack of resources, having extra duties due to absent staff, and things like this. When we ask leaders, why do you think you're not that effective? Budgets, clearly number one, then staff absences, staff shortages, regulatory policy, and lack of parent support. What we see actually is that there are more private centers than public ones, but that's not true across countries. It can go in both ways. Basically, you can see in the case of Korea and Germany, most of the centers are privately managed. In the case of Israel, Turkey, and Iceland, most of them are publicly managed. Sorry, the colors are inverted here, but that's basically what this chart will show you. The big question I want to raise at the end is, ideally, early childhood education and care is a great way to level the playing field. To basically give particularly those children who come from disadvantaged families the better conditions to develop. And that is actually still quite rare. But before I come to this, sorry, I have one more slide to show you. We can see that process quality is more likely to be inspected than the facilities of centers. You can see here in blue the process quality. That's what people look at, how staff work, how they relate to children, and so on. And obviously, that's also the primary driver of quality. You can see sort of inspection really taking this to heart and devoting sort of less attention now to facilities, which people take more for granted, and so on. So there you can see actually process quality, which we know is very, very important, where systems are moving from access to quality and from care to education, is also becoming a big driver of quality. Now, what I was just starting to talk about is actually this, how do we actually foster diversity? Here you can see the concentration of children according to a socioeconomic background, and you can see in countries like Chile, Turkey, Germany, quite a bit of concentration going on, social diversity becoming quite an issue for children. Here you can see the diversity approaches that are being used in daily interactions with children, use of books and pictures featuring people from a variety of ethnic and cultural groups, quite common in countries like Turkey, Chile, Korea, Israel, Iceland. And then the children sometimes play with toys and artifacts from cultures other than from the ethnic majority. Also that, increasingly, or quite common in a number of countries. But interesting, you look to countries like Germany and Norway, which actually both have a relatively high share of students, for example, with an immigrant background or refugees. There, those practices are not yet common. Again, it shows you that there may be, in some cases, a gap between the diversity of children that are in facilities and the kind of approaches that are being deployed to do this. And yeah, let me just make a brief point. And again, I said already how important it is for early childhood education and care to level the playing field, ensuring that particularly children from disadvantaged backgrounds have access to the best resources. But across countries, that's not what we find. We actually see quite similar percentages of highly educated staff across centers, across social backgrounds. We also see that group sizes are quite similar. So actually, very few countries seem to make deliberate efforts to align resources with needs, something that in the schooling sector is a lot more common these days. Many countries introduce things like formula-based funding, where actually the resources that are allocated to a school are in proportion to the challenges that school face. We haven't found anything like this in the data on early childhood education and care. So it's more or less an across-the-board policy, which means it's not progressive to support children from disadvantage in a more way. And you can see also when you look at the average number of staff per 10 children in early childhood education centers by center sizes, you can see how that can vary in small centers and large ones. So I will leave that here to give you enough time for your questions. Very much.
Andreas. Thank you very much, Andreas. We have received several questions from our participants today. I would encourage any other questions, if you want to send them through the chat function, our question moderator will be looking at them and we'll try to address as many as we can. So the first question, Andreas, is looking at the staff to child ratio, is there evidence that group sizes should be decreased? So that's a main question.
Yeah, it's always a question whether you ask that in absolute terms or relative terms. The difficult issue is that you can spend money only once. And if you have a limited budget, you have to make choices between, decreasing group sizes, paying staff better, giving more hours of time to children, and things like this. And when you ask them, we don't know to what extent group size actually affects outcomes. We have very little information on learning outcomes in the early years yet. But when you ask the staffs themselves, you could see from the data that it's often a kind of the primary perceived bottleneck. So we have evidence that staff perceive group sizes to be a big, bottleneck and also a factor driving stress. I think the evidence that, reducing group size is our best bet to use resources more effectively to achieve better outcomes. I think that's the kind of evidence that we are still lacking.
Excellent. And we've also had a few questions in terms of the job satisfaction of early childhood and education care workers. So it seems that there's a low level of job satisfaction in the profession and perception that staff are not valued by society. What could be done to raise the status of the profession?
Yeah, actually job satisfaction is much higher than the perception that people have about the value in society. And I think we should separate this. Most of the staff actually express, I would say, reasonably high levels of job satisfaction, at least in this survey, whereas they feel underappreciated by society. And there's several things I think that society can do about this. So the first thing is really about ensuring that the working conditions are attractive, that they are financially attractive, that they are intellectually attractive, that good work gets publicly recognized, that there are, some career perspectives for people, great support for professional development. So staff often work in very difficult conditions. Now they work, as you could see, with children from diverse backgrounds. They are, have to, work with the children, with the parents. It's actually a lot of responsibilities on the shoulders. And the one thing that we could do is provide a work environment in which staff are being recognized and supported for that. And we haven't shown you salaries in this presentation because that's not what we focus on, but we do have comparative data on this. And many countries, there's a quite significant gap between how we pay staff in early childhood education and care and those in other parts of the schooling system. So I do think there's a lot that society can do, that those who are the engineers of tomorrow's society, you know, I mean, they start working with our smallest children, have perhaps the greatest influence on the future of those children, that we are adequately rewarding this, that we're raising the status of the profession accordingly.
And I suppose related to that, there's some questions about the professional needs. So with regard to the top 3 professional needs, how would you explain that children development is not among those top 3 professional needs? Is it because their staff already have sufficient knowledge in these countries, or do you have a comment about that missing from the top?
Well, you know, from the responses, the why question cannot really be answered. But what I would assume is that, you know, most staff who go into early childhood education get quite a good level of training. You could see actually all of them virtually have a kind of post-secondary degree. Many in some countries have a bachelor degree. So, and I would expect, you know, a lot of that is about the child development. Now, you're talking less about subject matter content and more about childhood development than for example, in the school sector. So that wouldn't surprise me that people say, well, you know, I'm prepared for this. What I'm not really prepared for is for a rapidly changing nature of children in my center. Children, you know, from diverse backgrounds, children from, you know, fragmented families, all those kinds of things, special needs. So those are probably the more things that you teachers or staff could not possibly have been prepared for in their initial education, because those things really change. So in a way, I would sort of not expected so different answers, but this doesn't answer your question. Why? You know, that's something that we didn't ask.
We have someone who is sending in a question in terms of he's from India, or he or she, apologies, is from India. So would like to know if you have, or if the OECD has any similar study in India, or do we plan to do such a study? So I suppose talking about the expansion of this survey, is there plans in the future to expand this to more countries?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I mean, we don't have data for India simply because India has not yet joined the survey, but we are just about to start another round of this survey, and which will be conducted in 2024. And we would very much welcome India and any other country to join this survey. And again, you know, most of our surveys have started with a small group of countries, who thought this is a really interesting idea. We need to know more about the quality of the staff, the way their interactions with children and who they are. And so the survey has, you know, been established, and now we're going to expand this both in terms of the instrumentation and in terms of the participants. So we welcome anyone to join that survey.
Right. We have a few questions talking about inequalities and different kinds of countries. So one of them is, what kind of early childhood development programs are effective in low and middle income countries? Does the survey give us any results about that?
Actually, not directly so. No, I think that's a question. What the survey almost hints is that we're not paying very much attention to differentiation here. I would have expected, as I said, you know, more emphasis on, you know, children from disadvantaged families or centers in disadvantaged areas, and that's not what the survey really shows. It's more like, you know, the at least student staff ratios, all of those factors that we can measure do not really significantly vary across those kinds of contexts, less so than I would have expected. But maybe my colleague Stephanie might have ideas on that.
I really agree. I mean, that's when we look also at the practices staff are using with children. We can see, of course, they are using books that show children from a different ethnicity, for instance. But when we are thinking of more concrete practices that can be very helpful at this age, such as using toys of showing children from a different ethnicity, I mean, it's less use. So it's a bit interesting to see why there is a lot of diversity, even we are focusing on quite developed economies still. I mean, they are not, those practices are not so much used.
Thank you both. We have a general question, I suppose, that's just asking, what are the surprising results for you from this survey? And I suppose I'll hand that back to Andreas. Any surprising results for you?
Yeah, I think for me the biggest surprise was the variability that we see. It actually, maybe I should have known that before, but I was surprised how much many of the variables that we measure really vary, not just across countries, but also within countries. We are far away from having the kind of coherent systems that we see in higher levels of education in terms of, who people are, what they do, how facilities are resourced. First thing. Second thing, and we just talked about it, I would have expected a better alignment between resources and needs. We still seems to be a bit all over the place. And thirdly, I think the gap between staff feeling appreciated by the people who they serve directly, but underappreciated by society. I think that's something that should give us to think. How we can treat those people who probably matter most for the education of our children with a greater sense of professionalism.
We have a question here from a participant from Scotland who's asking, did you collect data on the number of funded hours of ECEC to which children are entitled in each country? They're asking this because there's some policy change happening in Scotland right now to do with that variable. Is that something that we looked at? Number of funded
hours? We look at this through the perspective of staff. So this is not really about entitlements. We do have those kinds of data as well. They are published in our report, Education at a Glance. But here we basically look at this more through the, what staff tell us about the hours that are being used.
A question here that's coming in now says variation in extent to which ECEC staff encourage parents to engage in home learning activities. So this is to do with the parents' time at home. Do you know if this variation is associated with the number of weekly hours that children spend in ECEC and or parents spending at work?
Interesting question. Maybe my colleague Stephanie can highlight this. The only aspect that strikes me is really how the emphasis that staff have about, encouraging parents to play or, do learning with their children at home very significantly across countries. As I mentioned before, I think it was Turkey and Chile where this is really common, and then, Iceland and Norway, where this is only the case in the minority of cases. It gives you a sense of, how staff themselves prioritize different activities. But I'm sure Stephanie has more to say on that.
I'm very sorry I cannot add a lot to that, Andreas, because we are asking staff, so we don't know about parents and what they do at work, and we don't know about children specifically and how much time they spend in ECEC. So that's not an information we have. We have the perspective of staff only. But that's a very interesting question.
Excellent. So we'll move on. There's a few more questions. So we'll see. If we don't get to them all, I do apologise in advance. One of them is, are staff who work in the sector adequately prepared for their jobs? Talking about professional development and training.
Well, that's a question that's very difficult to answer, because that notion of adequate would require a kind of almost direct assessment of staff qualifications. What I would say is that actually, at least in a number of countries, initial qualifications seem to be advancing. You could see actually a high share of staff now having at least a kind of bachelor's degree. Where I would have more questions is less about, how people go into the job, but about the quality and relevance and intensity of continued professional development. Here, I think the survey raises important questions. Now, you could see perceived needs, perceived barriers. I would argue those data at least raise questions that we need to do more to invest in more relevant, high-quality support of staff.
Excellent. There's another question in terms of the second cycle of this study. So are you happy with the first cycle results? What could the improvements for the second cycle be from your point of view?
Yeah, again, I'll let Stephanie to respond to this, but we are just, scratching the surface of this. This is the very first report coming out of this. It's going to take us quite a while to analyze in greater depth, how the survey might be evolving further. one aspect that I would like to see more is to go more into the nature of the activities that shape the, the environments in centers, and also to get some sense of outcomes. I think those are issues that we should certainly have to tackle, but I think it's going to take us in the countries some reflection. Ultimately, a survey like this is shaped by the interests or by the policy interests of the countries that take part in this. I'm sure the instruments will evolve. We will also keep some elements constant so that we can look at the evolution, but I'm sure there's going to be a lot of scope for further improvement and development.
Great. So I think we're close to running out of time. So what I might do is I might thank everybody who has submitted questions. Thank you, Andreas and Stephanie, for joining us here today. And thank you to our participants for your interest in this topic and the OECD's work on education. If you would like to find out more about TALIS Starting Strong, you can find the publication that has been released today on the OECD iLibrary under the name Providing Quality Early Childhood Education in Canada, Results from the Starting Strong Survey 2018. Once again, thank you all for joining us.
Thanks so much.